I was really new to all manner of union stuff when I signed on as a co-chair of the organizing campaign at the Bay Area News Group East Bay. I hadn't had a lot of involvement with unions, but we had a new corporate owner, the Media News Group, and they were merging our newsrooms with that of some sister publications. In a fairly short period of time, we saw some pretty dramatic changes in our newsroom, and I started to think of union organizing as a way to hopefully save some of the quality parts of our newspaper, some of the reasons that we really loved working there, and maybe to preserve the product a little bit for the people who read it. So as I said, I signed on as one of 3 co-chairs of our union organizing committee, which also had maybe a dozen other very active co-workers. And one of the reasons I felt a responsibility to step up, although I had a small child at home at the time, is that I felt like I would be very safe because of my work record. I'd always been a really good employee, probably by anybody's measure. I had won a lot of reporting awards. I worked really hard. I did a lot of volunteer jobs around the newsroom. I ran a charity campaign collecting school supplies for children. I had been tapped to serve on a company planning committee about the future of the newspapers a few years earlier. So I felt like I was somebody who, there was no question that I was a good employee, and that, that standing would make me an effective organizer, but it would also make me safe in the course of any campaign, as I wrote in that opening letter that he mentioned. When I went into this, I imagined that the most difficult part of organizing would be actually winning the hearts and minds of my coworkers, and that part is hard. It's especially in a newspaper that's always been non-union, especially in the sort of environment we live in, where people have so many ideas about unions and what they're about, so many misconceptions about what you're trying to do. We spend a lot of time telling people, a union is nothing but a tool for harnessing the power of numbers. It doesn't have to be any particular thing that you've heard. It doesn't have to be what happened to your uncle in 1957. This is our union, and it's about us and our voices and our vote. So we worked really hard, and over the course of maybe 3 or 4 months, we gathered authorization cards from, I think, 2/3 of our employees. And we went to the NLRB, just down the street here, and filed our cards. And they scheduled a union election. And of course, what I learned, which probably most of you know, is that the hardest part actually isn't getting your fellow coworkers to want the union. It's those weeks between the time when you file the cards and when the secret ballot election comes up. We'd had, of course, some opposition from management before that, but it really stepped up after we filed the cards. Our managers hired, and before I get into this part, I should say, I don't think our employer did anything different than what a lot of other employers do during a union organizing campaign. I think this is just sort of the way that the system works right now. I don't think much of what I'm about to talk about is unfamiliar to anybody who's been involved in an organizing campaign. But of course it was new to me because it was my first organizing campaign. So our employer hired an anti-union consultant, and they came in and began holding a lot of meetings in the workplace. There were 3 sort of levels of meetings. One was what we called a captive audience meeting, when everybody in the company is called together to hear about the union campaign and why it's going to be bad. In our workplace, there was often sort of a link between talking about union activity and talking about the economic difficulties in the newspaper industry and the possibility of layoffs. So that was always kind of linked in people's mind, that somehow a union might have something to do with layoffs. There were also a series of small group meetings, and that was maybe 10 or a dozen employees sitting down with our publisher and our executive editor, and they would run down some stuff about the union vote. seemed to me in the one that I attended that it was less about changing your mind and more about assessing where you stood as an employee so they could quickly meet with fairly large groups of people and find out where they stood. After that, some of their more effective tools really kicked in, and one of those is the one-on-one, which is a meeting of either 1 or 2 employees and 1 or 2 managers. They literally just pull you aside and sit you down in a room somewhere and start talking about why they think the union is a bad idea. There's nobody from the union side in those meetings usually, and there's a pretty wide range of what was said during those meetings based on reports we got from employees who had been in them. Some of it was almost funny, like the idea that if we voted in the union, you'd have to schedule your bathroom breaks through the union. So some of that you could laugh at, but some of it was very effective. They would take a junior reporter and tell her that once the union was voted in, she might never get to do a special project again, and she might not be able to advance in her career because the union would prevent that. And because these were people's direct supervisors, they kind of knew how to direct the employees, each pitch to the particular employee. As the vote got closer and closer, they held more and more of these one-on-one meetings, and it wasn't like you just did your one meeting and then you were done. One woman I know at the newspaper got called in so many times, she said she felt like a superdelegate. They at one of the first meetings, they almost swayed her, and then we talked about what they had said and why it wasn't right. So she was able to laugh at it, but at the same time, she was a little worried. Why me? Why do they keep calling me in? What does this mean for my career? You can easily imagine how intimidating that can be. Managers also posted an in-house website where employees were encouraged to anonymously discuss the upcoming union vote. And there were a lot of testimonials posted on the site by managers and supervisors. Many of them were very emotional pleas about how personally hurt they would be, how betrayed they would feel if their employees voted in the union. It sounds pretty transparent, but when you're in the middle of it, I think it's very emotionally affecting to hear those kind of messages from people that you know and trust, that you've worked with for years, supervisors that you like and respect. In addition to the in-house website, an employee anti-union committee popped up, and it was pretty clear that they had at least some ties to management, but they had, being employees and not managers or official representatives of the company, they could do a lot of things that managers couldn't, like if they saw somebody signing a union card, I saw this happen on at least one occasion, they could corner them when they got back into the newsroom and argue with them. Why were they doing this? Why were they making this choice? And they put up their own website that pretty directly threatened that there would be some sort of reprisals if the union was, some sort of retaliation if the union was voted in, including possibly a wage freeze, which was a pretty common theme all throughout the campaign, that our wages would be frozen if we vote the union in. And in fact, there was a rumor just a few days before the election that if the union was voted in, that there would be a pretty sizable layoff almost immediately after the vote. So those were the kinds of things that we had to deal with, and we were constantly trying to get back in touch with our coworkers and reassure them, this is okay, we can do this, we can do this, we can get a contract after we have the union, nobody's gonna know how you vote, it will be okay. One of the last things that happened right before the election was they circulated a petition to all the supervisors that said that they would never support having a union in the workplace, and one person that I worked with refused to sign it, one of the supervisors. They came back to him 3 times saying, are you sure, don't you want to sign this? And a few weeks after the election, he became one of the people that was laid off. And then in those final days, it really steps up where it's just constant meetings, sort of standing meetings in the workplace, so you can't avoid them, even if you're somebody who had sort of opted out of, somehow managed to wiggle out of all the other meetings. Constant emails, personal handwritten letters from the publisher asking people, please give him one more chance, please vote no. And so I'm really proud that despite all of this, we did win our union vote last June 13th with a... We had gone in with about 2/3 of employees signing cards, and the vote was much closer than that, I think about 52%, although our membership has since climbed much, our percentage is much better than that now. But it just goes to show you how effective that those campaigns can really be. So unfortunately, that wasn't the end of our story. Just 2 or 3 weeks after the election, we did get a notice of a major layoff, 29 employees. By our calculations, about 2/3 of them had been union supporters, and a handful of them were very vocal union supporters, people who had stood up in those meetings in the days prior to the campaign and said, you know, I want a union. I don't think what you're saying is true. You know, I think we should vote yes. And I was one of those 29 people. And for a lot of the people that worked with me, including somebody who was on the anti-union committee, it was pretty clear what the message was, which is that getting involved in union organizing is dangerous. You know, you better stay away from this if you value your career. So we filed a complaint with the NLRB. We're still pursuing that. The regional office here found that we hadn't, that the company had shown sufficient evidence that they had business reasons for including me and a couple of the other employees in the layoff. You know, hopefully things will go a different way in Washington, D.C., but we'll see. In the meantime, I was voted in as the unit chair, so we're really working hard on getting our first contract. We've been negotiating pretty much ever since the election, and we are making good progress, which is hopeful to us. But I think the Employee Free Choice Act would be very helpful to a new union in our position if a company decided to stall or to start not bargaining in good faith. There is actually a mechanism in the Act that allows you to go to federal mediation, and I think that's the kind of teeth many struggling unions might need to actually get toward a contract. So that's just one story. It's probably pretty familiar. I think a lot of organizing campaigns go that way. It was a big shock to me to end up on the layoff list. I was truly, truly surprised that that would happen to me. And of course, I've since learned that in organizing campaigns, about 1 in 4 private employers will lay somebody off. Usually, I would think it would be much earlier in the campaign. I think it's unusual for it to happen right after the vote, for it to be the unit chair or somebody who was an out-front leader of the campaign. But you know, it's an unfortunately very common thing, and it does resonate with other employees. You know, I still talk to people all the time who are afraid to get involved with union activity. You know, you don't have to lay off everyone who's involved in the union. You just have to make a statement, and unfortunately right now it's pretty easy to do that.
One of the amazing things to me about the election campaign that's just ended is that for the labor movement, it didn't end. It went right into the Employee Free Choice Act campaign, and I don't mean that just in terms of the spirit, but the infrastructure of of Labor 2008 that really was quite phenomenal, involving more national and local affiliates than we ever have, I think, before in a political campaign, has been largely kept intact, with many of the national unions that lent large numbers of staff to the election campaign, keeping them as part of a labor movement-wide campaign now with a single-minded focus on getting the Employee Free Choice Act passed. And so what up until now has largely been a very Washington campaign, a lot of lobbying on the Hill, trying to get House and Senate members and members of the new administration understanding and supportive, you know, has moved very, very quickly into the field. They've identified, as they did with the battleground states in the election campaign, what the battleground states need to be in the Employee Free Choice Act campaign. And I think it's moving along very, very nicely. I want to just spend a few minutes talking a little bit, with apologies to those who know an awful lot about the Employee Free Choice Act already, but just as a baseline here, what the Employee Free Choice Act would do, why it's necessary, and why I do think that there is a very, very good chance that it's going to happen. But before I do, I want to just mention another organizing campaign, in addition to the Contra Costa Times one, that I think illustrates so very nicely the reason why this piece of legislation is so necessary. And it's another campaign that I'm sure many of you know about because it's taking place here in California, although in Southern California. And it's the Los Angeles Car Wash Workers campaign that the AFL-CIO and the steelworkers have been undertaking in partnership with about 25 worker centers and other community groups in the Los Angeles area. I also want to thank Art Pulaski and the State Fed because they've been very actively supporting this campaign as well. And I know many of you in the room, Fran Schreiberg and Danielle Lucido with WorkSafe and others have been very involved in this campaign too. And the reason I think it has relevance to the Employee Free Choice Act Committee is the following. This is a campaign that involves about 10,000 car wash workers. People from outside California don't understand why, don't appreciate the fact that about 75% of all car washes in this country are in California, and most of those are in Southern California. But it takes about 10,000 car wash workers to staff those car washes. There are right now 430. There are about 430 individual car wash owners in the Los Angeles area alone that are the subject of this organizing campaign. And these are almost universally workers who are paid below minimum wage, who are not paid overtime, against whom utter wage theft is being committed on a daily basis, whose health and safety rights are being flagrantly violated every day. Really the most abysmal conditions of although unfortunately all too typical of low-wage worker industries, and with of course a very, very high percentage of immigrant and undocumented immigrant workers, making them all the more exploitable. And as I said, dispersed on average about 15 or 20 workers in 400 or so work sites. What was interesting about this campaign is it started as a sort of typical labor standards campaign with the legal service community in Los Angeles, and again, many of the worker centers working together to bring wage and hour lawsuits to vindicate wage and hour rights, and some health and safety actions as well. And gradually they realized that the employers were just settling these cases as a cost of doing business, that they were getting back pay, very modest back pay for a modest number of workers, but that none of this was doing anything to raise standards. And that even if they were ultimately successful in raising standards as part of the campaign, a larger growing campaign, that when the media spotlight was turned off and the government enforcement agencies moved on to the next targets, standards would just revert, unless there was an ongoing enforcement mechanism in the workplace in the form of collective bargaining. And in large part because of the growing relationship that the labor movement, the AFL-CIO, had been developing with the worker centers in Los Angeles through our worker center project, the worker centers came to the labor movement and asked if we would partner with them, if we could find a union that was interested in partnering, so that this labor standards campaign would have collective unionization and collective bargaining as the end goal, so that standards would not just be addressed and back pay vindicated, but that standards would then be improved and maintained through collective bargaining. So what we have now is something called the CLEAN Coalition, the Community Labor Environmental Action Network, that is trying to get employers to sign clean agreements which will commit to non-confrontational forms of recognition, as well as respect for adherence to minimum legal standards while we're trying to get there. But really what this group of workers represents is the far greater number than the ones that the Contra Costa Times employees do. In this gap, this huge gap of some 60 million Americans who have said they would have a union tomorrow if they could, and the 7.5% in the private sector, 12% overall of workers who currently have a union, this group who have not even been able to undertake an organizing campaign, much less suffered the kinds of typical repression that Sara has just described. So you've got, on the one hand, this small number of people who are brave enough to really what at this point in time almost involves committing revolutionary acts to undertake efforts through the NLRB to get a union. And the far greater number of people that don't even try, aren't aware that they can try, aren't aware of their rights, or understand that to stick their necks out this way is really asking for big trouble, but who themselves obviously need a union and want to have a union. So both of these groups are groups, I think, that would benefit tremendously from passage of the Employee Free Choice Act. And again, just to summarize very quickly what this would do, Sara's alluded to some of the things, but there are three components to the law. The first is the majority sign-up provisions, which basically would now say that if a majority of the workers sign a petition or sign cards showing that they want to have a union, that they could present that to the NLRB, and the NLRB then would certify that they have the right to have recognition without having to go through the current NLRB process. This does not, contrary to the Chamber of Commerce propaganda, this does not take away the right to secret ballot elections, even the so-called secret ballot elections that the NLRB sponsors, because any group of workers that wants to go through existing procedures would still have the right to do this. Section 9A of the Act would not be stripped from the existing law, and a group of workers that wants to go that route would still have the right to do it. Nor would this add or provide a new system that is foreign to the Act as it now stands, because again, although I'll be the first to acknowledge that we are not winning the education war, the public education war on this issue yet. Right now, as all of you know, you can under the Act get you can get card check recognition, majority sign-up recognition, but it's the employer who decides whether to recognize by means of majority sign-up or an election. And what all this would do is it would put that decision in the hands of the workers, not the hands of the employers. So that's the first title on recognition. The second is the first contract arbitration title. And that is a provision that would provide that after 90 days, if parties have not reached a first contract after recognition has been extended, that either side would have the right to go to the FMCS, get mediation, and after 30 more days, if they've not been able to resolve their contract, that the matter could be submitted to first contract arbitration for a 2-year agreement. Now, this provision grows out of the other reality, which Sara and her colleagues have not yet even had the opportunity to appreciate, which is that once the union comes in almost a half of all cases, the employer never agrees to a first contract. And as so many of you here in this room have appreciated firsthand, the first contract campaign simply becomes an extension of the organizing campaign, where an employer that has been intent on keeping the union out but has somehow screwed up and the union has gotten in, simply can achieve his same goal by stonewalling, surface bargaining, whatever. And again, as John Logan said a couple of moments ago, it doesn't even require unlawful acts or acts that are currently unlawful to keep if an employer is well advised, to keep an agreement from being reached. So this would address that. The third section of the law is the one dealing with penalties, It stems from a recognition that we're dealing with an utterly toothless law right now that lacks even the most modest remedies that other employment laws on the books contain. It would provide for triple damages in the case of organizing-related discharges. It would provide for $20,000 fines, in some instances civil penalties, and it would provide for mandatory 10J injunctions to equalize the mandatory injunctions that right now the law makes available to employers against unions for a number of unfair labor practices by unions. So, and I think probably that third is the one that's going to be the most useful in organizing in first contract campaigns. In any event, that's what the Employee Free Choice Act would do. It does not address all of the problems that we have, that's for sure. Many people say, what about striker replacement? What about the fact that the scope of the Employee Free Choice, of coverage under the Act is still so inadequate? What about all the issues involving the inequities involving secondary restrictions, secondary pressure restrictions? Yes, is the answer to that. This is a first step, but it is a critical first step that I think we feel addresses, the most basic inadequacies of federal labor law, a law that still declares as its official policy in the preamble, not changed even with the Taft-Hartley amendments, that the federal labor policy is one not of having a level playing field, but rather of encouraging unionization, encouraging collective bargaining. And we've obviously come an awfully long way from any kind of a policy or application of a law that is faithfully carrying that out. I think there are two major reasons why this law has a good chance of passage. One is an economic one and one is a political one, although they're very interrelated. The economic reason is that we've seen, and this really does get into the politics, in the last few years, a real shift from the way we've talked, the way the dialogue around federal labor law is proceeding and labor rights, as moving beyond just labor rights or human rights, which they are, to labor rights are critical for the economy. That they're critical not just for workers and for worker organization, but also to address the fundamental economic problems in our society. And this is actually, so many of the problems we're seeing in connection with the financial crisis are linked and are being widely recognized as linked to this widening income gap, income disparities, income distribution inequities that have been caused by the decline in collective bargaining and the obscene differences in pay between the CEOs, for example, and workers in just about every sector. McDonald's declared last month that they were going to initiate a campaign against passage of the Employee Free Choice Act. The CEO of McDonald's, James Skinner, makes $12.3 million a year. That is 600 times the average McDonald's employee who makes under $10 an hour. Walmart, just to take an old favorite, Lee Scott makes $31 million, made $31 million last year, which comes out to $16,000 an hour. That is just about the same as the average Walmart employee makes in a year. So, while we use, over the past few years, this is something that the labor movement has been playing up, trying to get publicity around. Now this is becoming much more mainstream, the problems that this causes for society. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago where a Bank of America analyst was saying, the problem with this financial crisis is that workers just don't have enough of money in their pockets and consumer spending is suffering as a result. Well, it's nice to see the Bank of America is realizing that. But what does this have to do with us? Well, it has. What you also see are these continuing studies, even by the Bush Labor Department, the U.S. Census Bureau, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the DOL, showing that even as density has gone down as much as it has, the union premium is still incredibly real. The difference, even after you adjust for all of the differences in education and training and geography and so on, for unionized workers versus non-unionized workers, is still overall something like 29%. And for women, it's 32%. For African Americans, it was 46%. 36%, I'm sorry, Latinos 46%. Same if you look at healthcare, the percentage of employers who contribute to workers' health plans in unionized facilities is something like 51% more than for employers that contributing to non-union facility workers. Same with pensions, same with short-term disability, vacations, down the line. So this, not to mention the effect that unionization has on the non-union competition in the same sector, employers wanting to avoid unionization, who do raise wages and do raise benefits to keep from being unionized, and of course the same for or the impact that unions have on and have historically had as the one lobbying organization that gets state and federal labor and employment legislation passed that are protective of worker rights. So all of these things, I think are seen by a growing body of economists, academics, and others as being necessary to reconstitute a middle class in this country, to regrow a middle class, to maintain a middle class, and I think that has been an encouraging factor for hopes of the Employee Free Choice Act. And tying that into the politics, the political reason why I think that there really is hope here is, especially starting with the elections, not just this year, but in 2006, you had a whole new group of senators and House members who got elected who, as economic populists, people who did see these connections. And the hearings that were held on the Employee Free Choice Act last year, or in 2007, in both the House and the Senate, were fascinating and very impressive in terms of the kinds of questions and statements made by lawmakers who were up there not just from the vantage point of, all right, well, this is what labor is pushing us to support, so as Democrats we'll support this, but who really were getting these kinds of economic connections, to the point that I think there really are a core of people, not just who are going to vote right, but who are really leading the way. George Miller from here in the Bay Area being the best example of someone who so totally gets it and understands, again, not just because labor is an important constituency to him, but because of how important this is for our economy and for the country, that I think that is having a very helpful effect on the politics of all of this. We'll see. 2 to 3 years ago, I don't think anybody thought there was a chance we'd be this far along. We had a lot of LCC lawyers writing into us saying, why is labor wasting its time on promoting an act like this? It's never going to happen. And we said, well, it certainly isn't going to happen in the next year or two, but it may happen in 10 years, and we've got to be ready. We've got to start at some point. Well, now it's 3 years, and there's a real chance that it is going to happen. And we're within a very close, I don't think anybody doubts that we're going to get this by the House, and we're going to get it by a majority in the Senate if we can get a vote on the merits in the Senate. And we certainly have a president who, made it very clear where he stands on this. So the challenge is going to be to get by cloture votes. And I don't think there's a lot of fun speculation going on about who's going to bail and who's going to be with us. Is Dianne Feinstein really going to be on our side? That's for you all to get out there and make sure it happens. I think there's a very good chance that it can, and we're certainly counting on the president and the new administration to be helpful there. So let me just close by saying that I think one thing that's worth keeping in mind here is that if what we were talking about was a situation where every 23 minutes, one African American worker in this country was fired from a workplace because he or she was an African American, or if we were talking about a situation where 75% of all employers were bringing in consultants, big law firms, to advise them on how to keep a Latino-free workplace, or if over the last 3 decades, acts of discrimination against women in the workplace had gone up by 500%. I think it's fair to say there would be such moral outrage, such broad-based moral outrage about this, that we wouldn't be having the kind of debates we have when we're talking about is the kind of discrimination against workers for trying to form a union that Sara has just described. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to see ourselves as part of the educational network that's got to be activated here to get people to understand how important this is, that we haven't had, that how antiquated our labor laws are, how they do not provide the protections that are needed, how the remedies are virtually non-existent, and how this situation cannot be allowed to stand, and get this done. So.
First, I wanted to say I really admire Sara's courage. I mean, in theory, there's something gravely wrong when, in 1935, with the National Labor Relations Act, we were in theory given the right to form, the federally protected right to form a union. And what are the right do you risk losing your job when you try to exercise that right? Not when you vote, not when you bear arms, not when you use free speech, but when you try to form a union, you face capital punishment on the job. And that's why it takes courage, unfortunately, to push for a union. So I'm going to try to speak about 3 things today. One, about the state of American workers. Second, I want to talk a little about why I believe the nation's labor law system is so broken. And third, I'd like to talk a bit about the prospects for the Employee Free Choice Act. So in this little book I wrote, which came out a few months ago, I really sought to bring to the nation's attention that things are really out of whack, out of balance for the nation's workers. And when I set out to write the book 3 years ago or so, I was like appalled that so much is going wrong for the nation's workers, yet there's hardly any discussion in Washington about it except for people like George Miller and Sherrod Brown of Ohio. And I was just amazed that there was so little public discussion of it. So when I say that things are badly broken or out of whack for the nation's workers, what do I mean? We just finished an economic recovery from November 2001 through December 2007. And this probably will turn out to be the first economic recovery in the nation's history where median household income has actually declined, which is startling to think about because, in theory, all boats are supposed to rise during a recovery, and then we hit a recession and people suffer. But, going into this recession, people are already worse off than they were at the end of the last recession. So something is badly broken. And one reason why median income is down is that wages have been absolutely flat for the past 6-7 years. And there are many reasons for that: pressures from globalization, another disaster for the nation. Another thing that appalled me that there's so little public discussion about is that since the year 2000, we've lost 1 in 5 manufacturing jobs in the nation. And 3.5 million manufacturing jobs, and these are generally good middle-class jobs with good benefits and good wages. And another thing that appalled me is Washington paid virtually no attention to the hemorrhaging of our manufacturing sector until 2-3 months ago with what's happened in Detroit. Another way that workers are being squeezed, and this is why I call it the big squeeze, or maybe I should have called it the big squeezes or the many squeezes, is what's happening with health insurance. Again, we had economic growth from 2001 through late last year, yet the number of people without health insurance actually rose by 8 million during an economic recovery. And that's both startling and appalling. Now, officially last year, 46 million Americans are uninsured. I'm sure by now it's up to 48, 49 million, which basically means that in the world's richest nation, 1 in 6 people do not have health insurance. And there's something badly broken there. And even for families that have health insurance, for the typical worker who has family health coverage, that worker is paying $1,600 more out of pocket, twice as much out of pocket in healthcare premiums than was the case 7 years ago. So again, something's badly broken. The wages are absolutely flat after inflation, yet workers are paying $1,600 more out of pocket each year for family health coverage. As those of you know who have 401ks, our pension system, retirement security system is really, I mean, it's an oxymoron. It's a misnomer to call it a retirement security system. We should really call it a retirement insecurity system. And some people say we're not going to have many people retiring anymore because so many people are not going to have enough money to retire on. And I've written some stories lately about people in their early 60s who thought they had enough in their 401k so that they thought they would be able to retire in 2-3 years at age 65 or 67. But now many people are saying, well, I was going to retire at 65 or 67, now I'm thinking maybe 75, 77. I mean, it's really, that's a real phenomenon out there, and it's very scary. And when I speak to some economists, they say, we're seeing this new competition for jobs between the 70-year-olds who want to be supermarket cashiers and the kids coming right out of high school who want to be supermarket cashiers. This terrific economist at the New School, Teresa Gillajucci, sometimes says, 60 and 70 is the new 20. It's in certain ways. Another aspect of where things have gone south, where things have gone badly for workers, is with income inequality. And John actually stole the sentence I was going to use about that great liberal Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, who said, if inequality had not increased since 1980, if inequality had remained at the same level, the bottom 80% of Americans would be $670 billion wealthier. And people argue about whether Summers is conservative, is centrist. I mean, he's written things like this for the Financial Times that clearly he's seen that something is very wrong with what's happened in incomes and inequality. Some startling statistics, according to the Congressional Budget Office, in the past quarter century, for the middle fifth of Americans, income is up 21% after inflation over a quarter century. The main reason for that increase is the woman in the household is working like many more hours than was the case a quarter century ago. So the main reason that income has gone up for the middle fifth is more working hours. For the bottom fifth of Americans, according to the CBO, income is up 6%. So 6% for the bottom, 21% for the middle. For the top fifth, incomes are up 80%. And for the top 1%, incomes have more than tripled. They're up 228%. So that explains why Larry Summers said what he did. Paul Krugman wrote a few months ago, before the economy fell off a cliff, he wrote, "It's a great economy if you're a high-level corporate executive or someone who owns a lot of stock. For most other Americans, economic growth is a spectator sport." Then I also love this quote. I asked people, guess who said this? Was it John Edwards, Ralph Nader, or Jesse Jackson? The average American went exactly nowhere has gone absolutely nowhere on the economic scale since 1980. He's been on a treadmill while the super rich have been on a spaceship. So who said that? None of those three. It's Warren Buffett, the nation's wealthiest man. And Buffett also said, I was worried when I wrote some of these statistics in the book, some people would say, oh, you're advocating class warfare. You're pointing out that the rich are doing better than the poor. That's class warfare. So Buffett said, there's class warfare all right, but it's my class, the rich class, that's making war and we're winning. So Buffett's a smart guy. Last aspect of the squeeze that I'll talk about is people in the middle class. Americans are struggling to keep up. Wages aren't going anywhere. Median incomes have fallen. So people, are working many more hours than before. The typical middle class household, in the typical middle class household, the two parents taken together are working 500 hours more than was the case 20, 25 years ago. That's 13 and a half full-time weeks. That means less time to be with each other, less time to be with kids. That's not exactly a healthy thing. The typical American worker works 135 hours, nearly 3.5 full-time weeks more than the typical British worker, 240 hours, 6 full-time weeks more than the typical French worker, and 370 hours more, 9 full-time weeks more than the typical German worker. These are statistics from not a lefty outfit, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. So Americans are kind of working more but enjoying it less, so to speak. So in light of all these, I'm supposed to do an advertisement for my book for a second. I'll be happy to sign books afterwards. We had I was trying to get more books here, but the shipment did not come through. I'm sorry. Anyway, so in light of these economic statistics and how tough things are workers, it's no surprise that, according to a poll by Peter Hart Research, 53% of Americans say they would vote to join a union tomorrow if they could. So, and as this John said, that's about 60 million workers. So on one hand, 60 million workers are saying, I join a union tomorrow if I could, yet over the past quarter century, the number of workers in unions has gone from 21 million to 15.7 million. The percentage of people in unions has basically gone from 24% to half that. And the main reason by far is employer opposition to unions. And as I said, we in theory have this federally protected right to unionize, to join a union, yet this right is very hard to invoke that right because you really risk having your head chopped off on the job. And at the risk of repeating some things that the two Johns had said, John Dunlop, the great labor economist at Harvard who served 11 different presidents, he headed this Commission on Labor Law Reform in the 1990s, and his commission found that union supporters were retaliated against, fired, demoted, put on terrible night shift, had their hours cut. Union supporters were retaliated against in 1 in 4 union elections. His commission also found that 1 in 18 union supporters in a unionization election is retaliated against, fired, demoted. I know some studies say 1 in 4 are fired. A poll conducted for the Dunlop Commission found that 79% of Americans believe that it is very or somewhat likely that non-union workers will get fired if they try to organize a union. That's a startling figure. And again, this is John Dunlop, a Republican who served in the Nixon with President Nixon, President Ford, so that even he found these startling numbers was pretty amazing. In my book, I write about some courageous workers who led efforts to unionize at their places of work and the horrible things that happened to them just for trying to exercise their right. I write about a terrifically courageous woman in Syracuse in upstate New York. She worked in a plastics factory that made cups for yogurt and cottage cheese. And at this little factory with 190 production workers, in a 13-month period, 4 of the 190 workers had fingers chopped off. And so that was horrible, but the sexual abuse, sexual discrimination there was terrible as well. The top 20 jobs on the production floor were technician jobs fixing the machinery. 19 of the 20 jobs were held by men, and the factory basically told the women those jobs are for men. The worst jobs are the horrible jobs, standing by the machines, picking up the thousands of plastic cups as they come out. You can't imagine a more boring job. 92, 94% of those jobs are held by women. So Kathy Salmier, said enough of this, and she really spearheaded a unionization drive by the steelworkers. And so what did the company do? First, she shows up at work one day, and management says there's a police officer waiting for you downstairs, and he interrogates her about, well, there's an anti-union worker whose car would not start this morning. We believe that you sabotaged it. And she went to the police station. She was worried she was going to get fired. They finally took the car to an auto repair shop, and they found that it was just a defective sensor light. And then a few days later, she was transferred into what's basically solitary confinement. She had to work by herself, not being able to talk to anyone else for all 8 hours. And they were hoping clearly she would quit after 2 weeks. She didn't quit, and they moved her back onto the factory floor. A few weeks later, she comes into work. The human resources director says, I need to talk to you. And she says, I hate to tell you this, but you're being suspended. We're accusing you of sexually abusing 2 male workers on the factory floor. And she was accused literally of pulling down their pants and touching them inappropriately. And this is a woman who had been adopted by the clergy of Syracuse for courageously leading the fight against the amputations and against the sexual discrimination. And they picked some pretext to really disgrace her in the eyes of the community. And long story short, went to the steelworkers, which did a heroic job on this, fought for her, went to the National Labor Relations Board. After 14 months, which is a relatively short time, as I'll explain in a second, she was reinstated. But of course, by the time she was reinstated, everyone else had grown so scared of participating in the unionization effort because the most courageous person was beheaded at work. I write about some other examples. I write about a nursing home aide in North Miami, Marie Sylvain, an immigrant from Haiti. And she got sick and tired of having to care for 14 patients a day. She said she usually didn't have time to take lunch. She had to work for lunch. Her shift was 7 o'clock to 3 o'clock. She said when 3 o'clock came, she often had 2 patients yet to finish with, so she'd work an extra hour or 2 off the clock to finish up. So when she heard there was a union organizer around, she got very involved. Long story short, right after the unionization vote, she went to visit her mother in Haiti. When she came back, there were 2 surprises. The union had lost by 2 votes, and second, her name was taken off the job rotation. And she said, what's that about? And they said, well, you forgot to turn in your vacation request form. And she said, bull. I know I'm supposed to do that. So after 4.5 years of litigation, 4.5 years, and the union must have spent, what, $10, $20, $30, $40, $50,000. After 4.5 years of litigation, she got her job back, but of course by then the unionization drive was dead. And I wrote about a friend, as well in my book, I wrote about a friend of Marie Sylvain named Ernst Duval, another immigrant from Haiti. He also was the rank and file leader of an organizing drive at a nursing home in South Florida. He was fired for allegedly trying to choke a nurse. And it took 6 years of litigation. The ALJ, the National Labor Relations Board in Washington, the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, to have him reinstated. So what was the penalty for the employer there? The employer was ordered to pay $1,757 in back wages for firing someone 6 years ago. So for a modest investment of $1,757, the nursing home was able to kill an organizing drive. And why was the penalty so low? Because you're able to subtract all the other wages he made in other jobs, and he became a translator for Catholic Charities. So they subtracted all that. So, as the 2 Johns were saying, the remedies in the National Labor Relations Act are quite toothless. It's like, I was trying to compare, if you have a kid and first he's trying to choke his younger sister, and you say, don't do that, I'm going to really, throw the book at you, I'm going to really punish you, and then your son turns around and then kicks his sister in the head. And under the National Labor Relations Act, the only penalties really are putting on the bulletin board that you've been a bad boy, that you've broken the law, and you promise not to do it again. Those are basically the extent of the penalties, except for some back wages. The National Labor Relations Act doesn't really call for any fines. And as John Hiatt and John Logan said, one of the problems is the extent, the systematic way many companies break the law in fighting unions, but it's also true that many unions can stop unions by cleverly acting legally, through all these one-on-one meetings that Sara described, all these mass meetings, all these videos. I quote Richard Bensinger, the former organizing director of the AFL-CIO. One of the crazy things is, the employers can really propagandize employees 24/7. Whenever you're at work, they could, sit you down for a meeting, they could show you a video, and the union organizers are not even allowed to set foot on the on company property. And Benziger said to me, it's like when Bill Clinton was running against Bob Dole. It's like Bill Clinton has access to all 50 states all of the time, and Bob Dole would be on the Canadian border with a megaphone trying to shout across to the 50 states. I mean, things are way out of whack. Now, as a reporter for the New York Times, I really can't take a position one way or the other on the Employee Free Choice Act. And I have some sympathy for secret ballot elections, don't get me wrong. I do think the Employee Free Choice Act would be very good in helping labor unions reverse their decline. For companies, I can understand why companies are fighting it so hard. Unions will become stronger, unions will push for better wages and benefits, and management's very upset that it might mean a loss of managerial prerogatives and managerial freedom. And that's why someone I interviewed at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce said the fight over this will be Armageddon. And he said, get that, Steve, I want you to use that word, Armageddon. And I do think the business lobby is going to spend $50, $100 million. This is going to be a very big fight. And I spoke yesterday at this labor relations conference in San Francisco, and Rich Trumka, the #2 of the AFL-CIO, was there. I was saying, but I think the Employee Free Choice Act is in trouble because it might not get the 60 votes in the Senate that it needs to block a Republican filibuster. And Rich Trumka says, we, the AFL-CIO, are going to gear up and pressure people and pressure Democrats to stay loyal. And apparently some Democrats are starting to waver about the Employee Free Choice Act. The two moderate Democratic senators in Arkansas, Mark Pryor and Blanche Lincoln, there have been reports that Dianne Feinstein is thinking now is not the time, that we have this economic crisis. The business community is saying, business has enough to worry about right now. We're laying off people. We're struggling to make profits. The last thing we need is this on our plate to start battling with unions. So I think there are several big questions now. One is, I think if Obama really gets behind the Employee Free Choice Act and really says this is an important vehicle to help lift American workers, the American middle class, I think some of the wavering Democrats might remain loyal to it, and I think some Republicans might even get on board. But if Obama might say, I don't want to pick a holy war, have a holy war with the nation's business community, especially when we're suffering this economic crisis, and he might try to kick this can down the road 6 months, a year and a half. And some people say, Robert Rice, the former labor secretary, was saying at this conference in San Francisco that if it ain't done in the first 100 days, it's not going to happen, because that's when President Obama will have the momentum. And then Richard Trumka says, we're gonna fight to the max to try to make sure that Obama moves forward with it. Rice had this wonderful anecdote yesterday that at FDR's second inauguration, a woman came up to him and said, you got to do this, you got to do this, we need you to do this, we need you to do that, we need you to do this. And he said, Madam, you have to make me do it. And I think Bob Rice, Trumka was saying that if that this might be an uphill battle because the Democrats only have 57, 58, 59 seats in the Senate, depending on whether you include Al Franken and Roland Burris. But it might be hard to get 60, so it really will be, it's going to be an interesting few months of legislative fighting.